As I mentioned, our CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford had a sit-down with Attorney General William Barr about Robert Mueller's report and his public statement. Barr said that Mueller could have reached a conclusion on the issue of obstruction of justice. Mueller, however, his take was that he believed it would be unfair to reach a decision. And because if he did, according to him, he said he would not be able to charge the president due to the Justice Department policy. I want to play for you a bite. This comes from Jan Crawford's interview with Attorney General Bob Barr.
He said that he couldn't exonerate the president. You looked at that evidence, and you did. I mean, what's the fundamental difference between your view and his?
Well, I think Bob said that he was not going to engage in the analysis. He was not going to make a determination one way or the other. We analyzed the law and the facts, and a group of us spent a lot of time doing that and determined that both as a matter of law, many of the instances would not amount to obstruction.
As a matter of law? As
a matter of law. In other words, we didn't agree with the legal analysis. A lot of the legal analysis in the report, it did not reflect the views of the department. It was the views of a particular lawyer or lawyers. So we applied what we thought was the right law.
That decision, offered up in a 4-page summary, opened the Attorney General to criticism.
The response was that you were too soft on the president, that actually the special counsel was a little sharper on obstruction.
I was just trying to state the bottom line, and the bottom line was that Bob Mueller identified some episodes. He did not reach a conclusion. He provided both sides of the issue, and his conclusion was he wasn't exonerating the president, but he wasn't finding a crime either.
I do not believe it is appropriate for me to speak further about the investigation.
While Barr testified before Congress about the special counsel's report, Mueller wants the report to speak for itself and signaled he does not want to testify.
Do you think he should?
It's up to Bob, but I think the line he's drawing, which is that he's going to stick to what he said in the report, is the proper line for any department official.
We asked Barr about Mueller's final caution.
That there were multiple, systematic efforts to interfere in our election.
How's the Justice Department working now to ensure this doesn't happen again in 2020?
Yes, well, we do have I think a increasingly robust program that is focusing on foreign influence in our election process. I talked recently to the director of the FBI about putting together a special high-level group to make sure we're totally prepared for the upcoming elections.
Do you think enough was done in 2016?
Probably not.
The president has repeatedly accused former intelligence officials of dropping the ball by fixating too much on his campaign.
They were spying. They were spying on our campaign.
You've testified that you believe spying occurred.
Yes.
Into the Trump campaign.
Yes.
You've gotten some criticism for using that word.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's become a dirty word somehow. It has never been for me. I think there's nothing wrong with spying. The question is always whether it's authorized by law.
Some former intelligence chiefs have said the president has made that word somewhat pejorative, that they're spying, this is a witch hunt, this is a hoax. And so your use of that word makes it seem that you're being a loyalist.
It's part of the craziness of the modern day that if a president uses a word, then all of a sudden it becomes off bounds. It's a perfectly good English word. I'll continue to use it.
What have you seen? What evidence? What makes you think I need to take a look at this?
Like many other people who are familiar with intelligence activities, I had a lot of questions about what was going on, and I assumed I'd get answers when I went in, and I have not gotten answers that are at all satisfactory, and in fact have probably more questions, and that some of the facts that I've learned don't hang together with the official explanations of what happened.
What do you mean by that?
That's all I really will say. Things are just not jiving.
I want to bring back in Zeke Miller and Nancy Cortez. So, Nancy, clearly the Attorney General and Robert Mueller see the issue of obstruction differently. There are those who believe that it's up to Congress now to break this tie, if you will. I'm curious about what folks are saying on Capitol Hill after the conversations that have taken place between these two men, separately. Is the calls for impeachment by Democrats growing? And do you see this as something, a really viable option at this point?
I think the biggest change I'm seeing on Capitol Hill, Rena, is that the conversation among Democrats has shifted from whether to impeach the president, or at least initiate impeachment proceedings, to when should Congress initiate those impeachment proceedings. So a majority of Democrats, including the House Speaker, still believe that they should wait and continue to build their case, but they're no longer saying that it is something that is a last resort. In fact, Speaker Pelosi was on Jimmy Kimmel, and he was asking her about this, and she said, well, you know, the important thing is that we really need to build our case first and make sure that it is airtight before we move to impeachment. And he said, well, will you be able to do that by the 2020 elections? And she said, yes. So she is essentially saying now, hold your horses. It is going to happen. It's just not going to happen yet. And that's a very different message than we were getting just last week.
That's so interesting, Nancy. So Zeke, you heard Nancy say it's not if, it's when, according to some Democrats on the Hill. Does the White House share that sentiment? Are they preparing for potential impeachment?
They've been preparing for this eventuality since it became obvious to them last year that Democrats were going to regain control of the House. At the same time, they're not all that concerned about it. It's a political proceeding. Republicans control the Senate, where an impeachment trial would be conducted. So there's no real peril to the president remaining inside the White House from that standpoint. And they believe that there's a massive political upside to this, and that's one of the reasons why we had seen up until now a lot of hesitancy among Democrats to sort of go down that path, and sort of Nancy Pelosi putting tamping the brakes a little bit on that to try to slow things down so that Democrats wouldn't sort of give the White House this win on this issue. If Democrats do ultimately do this, and what I've heard tracks with what Nancy said also, but with the important caveat that there's a bet on the part of some senior Democrats that the closer we get to the 2020 election, the harder it actually does become to begin impeachment proceedings. So there may be a lot of noise around that, but saying we'll think it will come to it next year after we do some more investigations might sort of preclude it actually coming to fruition before the 2020 election. If that's the case, that wouldn't give the White House the political upside they're looking for. Then that may be the narrow space that Nancy Pelosi is trying to carve out for herself.
I want to talk to you both also about treason. The president often accuses James Comey and others of having committed treason during the course of their investigation. Here's what Bob Barr had to say.
Well, as a lawyer, I always interpret the word treason not colloquially but legally, and there are very specific criteria for treason. So I don't think it's actually implicated in the situation we have now. But I think
legally,
right.
You don't think that they've committed treason?
Not as a legal matter, right?
So it appears the Attorney General broke with the president on the treason claim, but he did express concern about whether this was illegal spying conducted on the Trump campaign. Zeke, how much stock is the White House putting on Barr's review of the probe?
Yeah, they've been talking this up now for the past month or so. The president delegated declassification authority, sort of a fairly extraordinary step, to the Attorney General last week. That sets up a bit of a clash between the Attorney General and maybe the FBI, the CIA, other intelligence agencies that are very hesitant to turn over their sensitive documents surrounding sources and methods and things like that. But the president, White House officials say, believes that there was impropriety in the investigations into his campaign, and he believes that he has a loyalist in place in Attorney General Barr to see that through and see an investigation come to fruition. How much of that will ultimately be made public? Now that's in the hands of the Attorney General, who has the ability to declassify some of these underlying documents, and that could be a really interesting fight over the next several weeks and months.
There was so much to this interview to rehash, but I want to play one more final remark from the Attorney General where he expressed concerns about what's happening to America's institutions and what he called a hyper-partisan period.
I think one of the ironies today is that people are saying that it's President Trump that's shredding our institutions. I really see no evidence of that. It's hard and I really haven't seen a bill of particulars as to how that's being done. From my perspective, the idea of resisting a democratically elected president and basically throwing everything at him and really changing the norms on the grounds that we have to stop this president, that's where the shredding of our norms and our institutions is occurring.
Nancy, I'm curious about Democrats, especially those running for president. They would maybe argue that this is sort of the heart of what 2020 is about, or something, an important issue, I guess I should say, in 2020. There were concerns even under the Obama administration about whether the integrity of the Department of Justice was somehow being eroded. What are folks saying about this issue on Capitol Hill?
Well, I think, first of all, Democrats would argue that the Attorney General is being pretty charitable when he says that he can't find any evidence of the president shredding institutions. Democrats would say, just look at the president telling his aides not to cooperate with congressional subpoenas or calling journalists the enemies of the people. They'd say that is striking at the heart of American institutions like the freedom of the press and the First Amendment, or the co-equal branches of government. So Democrats certainly aren't going to agree with Barr on that front. But, he was handpicked by the president. It's no surprise that he is going to find more fault with the other side. So it's not something that is really shocking to them. And frankly, they have sort of already put Barr in a particular box. Speaker Pelosi has gone as far as to say she's lost all respect for him. And she just assumes at this point that he is going to carry the president's water. And I think that Barr was trying to push back on that notion pretty strenuously in his interview with Jan and argue that everything that he's done has a legal underpinning. But Democrats believe that he has put his thumb on the scale every step of the way in this process.
I want to thank you both. I think we gave you guys our A and entire B block to unpack. Jan Crawford's a wonderful interview. I want to thank you both, Nancy Cortez and Zeke Miller, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Thanks.